Welcome to the debate. Today, we're really digging into a core ethical question in climate change. Where does the primary duty for mitigation actually lie? Is it fundamentally institutional, resting on governments and policies, or is it rigorously individual, demanding immediate personal lifestyle changes? This tension really emerges when you look at the philosophical work, especially from people like Fragnière and Torpman. For me, the core priority has to be institutional, driven by the need to promote collective action, because only that kind of structural change has the required effectiveness.
And I see it from a slightly different angle. While, of course, effectiveness is crucial, I'm going to argue for a robust individual duty that's rooted not so much in those macro outcomes, but in moral integrity and the violation of fundamental rights. Drawing on that libertarian perspective you see in Tortman's work, the focus really must be on individual responsibility for our specific actions. The main argument you always hear against personal responsibility is, well, the so-called problem of causal ineffectiveness, the idea that one person's emissions are just a drop in the ocean, too minute to make any measurable difference. But I just don't think that holds up. Tortman argues this whole line of reasoning completely misses the core moral point. Our individual emissions, no matter how small they seem, constitute an unconsented boundary crossing. By putting harmful material into the shared atmosphere, we are infringing on libertarianism's non-aggression principle. The wrongness isn't about the scale of the final disaster. It's rooted in the act of violation itself.
I do appreciate that rights-based reframing. I do. But my concern is always the real-world application. Fragnier's review highlights that if you focus purely on individual lifestyle duties, you ignore the inevitable reality of widespread noncompliance. You just can't get everyone on board without a collective, enforced scheme. And further, the individual duty can't be so incredibly demanding, requiring people to just never fly again or sell their car, especially given the structural constraints we all live with. The real leverage we have as individuals is as citizens, using our political duties to push for collective solutions. That's the only way to get comprehensive and, frankly, fair emissions reduction.
But we can't just dismiss the severity of the individual act. When we move past that abstract idea of causal ineffectiveness, we have to confront the quantitative estimates. Nolt, who's cited by Fragnière, argues that the lifetime emissions of an average person in the West can, statistically, cause substantial suffering or even death over the next century. So this calculation, it transforms the abstract moral wrong into a quantifiable mortal harm. It confirms that the individual act has very real moral significance.
Right, and I recognize the moral weight of that calculation. Those effects are tragically real. But that moral weight doesn't solve the structural problem of control. So much of our carbon footprint is, it's predetermined by the society we live in. The power grid, transportation systems. These are things we can't change unilaterally. So imposing those extreme lifestyle sacrifices is, I think, just too demanding on the few who are conscientious. It creates a deeply unfair burden in a situation of partial compliance, where most people just aren't participating. Now, to try and define the limits of this duty, Henry Hsu's distinction between subsistence emissions and luxury emissions is certainly useful. But Fragnière points out that eliminating only luxury emissions, say stopping unnecessary flights, is almost certainly insufficient to meet our climate targets. We need deep institutional shifts, like retrofitting entire energy grids to safely reduce even our subsistence emissions. And that, to me, is clearly a duty for governments, not for isolated citizens.
That is a compelling point, but this is where Tortman sharpens the moral requirement significantly. While subsistence emissions might be, you could say, implicitly consented to, we all need to survive after all, non-subsistence emissions inherently violate rights unless the individual completely offsets them. This obligation, it's stringent, it's non-negotiable, and it underscores the absolute necessity of personal moral integrity. If you are contributing to a rights infringement through your non-subsistence emissions, that duty to compensate is yours immediately, regardless of what your government or your neighbors are doing.
So ultimately, I think we agree that individuals have duties of both kinds, to change their lifestyle and to act as citizens promoting policy. The real disagreement, it seems, lies in where we place the priority. I prioritize the collective project, because I believe that effectiveness and justice require those governmental mechanisms for efficiency and for the fair distribution of the burden.
Whereas I focus on the imperative of principle, the injustice of the individual act itself, that boundary crossing, demands immediate personal responsibility. It demands moral integrity, even when institutional action feels distant or, frankly, ineffective. For me, upholding that moral principle has to come before the collective outcome.
And the debate continues regarding which of these two crucial duties takes precedence when they conflict. It leaves the listener, I think, to weigh the moral integrity of their own actions against the effectiveness of their institutional engagement.